Hello, I'm Sandra Rapoport. This is the second of a two-part mini-series on the Book of Ruth entitled Ruth, Two Love Stories. Each lecture lasts about 30 minutes. I hope these lectures enhance your Shavuot holiday. At the end of the first lecture of Megillat Ruth, the Book of Ruth, we stood with Naomi and Ruth at the border of Moab and Judah, where Ruth has just sworn her loyalty to Naomi, to her Israelite land, and to her Israelite God. Naomi would have to have been made of stone not to respond to Ruth's plea, and the text tells us that in Naomi's silence we can read her assent. A dumbstruck Naomi, in fact, abruptly ceases her attempts to persuade Ruth to return to Moab. For better or worse, she has got herself a travel companion and a daughter. In fact, Ruth's pledge to Naomi is interpreted by the Talmud and Midrash, the Bible's legend literature, as Ruth's sincere conversion from Moabite to Israelite. Not only that, but Ruth's words are quite likely the test of her worthiness to become a woman of Judah. How so? Well, important biblical characters are often tested. Ruth's willingness to go forth. In Hebrew, Ruth's willingness to perform a lech lecha, in the words of the Torah, whether in response to God's summons or in response to a tug of conscience, of instinct, of trust in another. The willingness to go forth is a critically important test for biblical strangers. And was not Abraham a stranger at the outset of his story? Abraham was just a nomadic shepherd, son of an idol maker, when he heeded the first summons to go forth, to lech lecha. Rebekah, while kin of Abraham and Sarah, was also a stranger, a girl from the other side of the family, the unredeemed side that still worshipped idols. First Abraham and then Rebekah, both strangers to God and to the land God had selected, were, hundreds of years before Ruth and Naomi, tapped to take the same test of lech lecha, of going forth into the unknown. And as we know, each of them passed it. Each left their birthplace and their family, went forth into the terrifyingly unfamiliar, found the land to which God was leading them, and became part of the covenantal family. The Ruth of our Megillah, Ruth the Moabite, is likewise being tested for greatness. Will she go forth with Naomi, forsaking her birthplace, leaving her mother's house, to travel to an unknown land and to adopt the ways of a strict and invisible God? Or will Naomi succeed in discouraging her, sending her back to Moab? As we've seen, when Ruth declares in chapter 1, verse 16, Ki el asher telchi elech, wherever you go, I will go. Ruth becomes, in our eyes, like Rebekah before her, who uttered that exact word, elech, at a similar and critical juncture or crossroads in her young life. In this same way, and with the same word, Ruth too becomes a daughter of Israel. And in fact, we read, when Naomi saw how determined Ruth was to go with her, she ceased to argue with her, and the two women went on until they reached Beit Lechem. We move quickly through the story now. Ruth and Naomi return to Beit Lechem on a crowded market day, and the text tells us that the town is struck dumb when they see their old friend Naomi. Can this be Naomi? Is the whisper and the cry. And Naomi acknowledges their shock and tells the village women not to call her Naomi, meaning pleasantness in Hebrew, but to call her Mara, meaning bitterness, because God has punished her and her family, taking everything from her. She returns to Judah destitute, empty, and embittered. But not quite. Naomi is blessed with one precious asset, her daughter-in-law Ruth, who volunteers to glean, as a poor person is permitted to do in Israel, at the corners of the rich man's field, in order to feed her mother-in-law and herself. Well, so far, we have focused on the first part of our love story dyad. In Judah, the second part of the story of Ruth will unfold. The text tells us in chapter 2, "Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a mighty man of substance of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz." Boaz, we're told, is an Ish Gibor Chayil, a mighty man of valor, a powerful man, a wealthy man, a tribal chieftain, who also happens to be a known relative of Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. Boaz is an honored, honest, and wealthy man, learned and respected in Beit Lechem, Naomi's hometown. Importantly, at the time of our story, Boaz is childless and a widower. Unbeknownst to Ruth or Naomi, the nearby field in which Ruth chooses to glean belongs to Naomi's kinsman, Boaz. Naomi is too embarrassed by her reversal of circumstances to approach any of her kin for help, and yet Ruth, the former Moabite princess, has accidentally chosen to glean along with the other destitute Judahites at the edges of Boaz's field. And Boaz notices the strange gleaner. Perhaps Ruth dressed differently from the others, or she holds herself differently. The Midrash, the Bible's legend literature, suggests all this. And he inquires about her, and he appears altogether fascinated by her. In full view of all the harvesters, Boaz offers this strange girl a gift of 6 measures of barley, food in his field shed, and he promises her protection from harm if she will consent to glean only in his fields over the course of the 3-month barley harvest. Ruth is embarrassed by Boaz's attention, yet she bows her head and is overwhelmingly relieved that she will be permitted to glean in this great man's field. She and Naomi will not go hungry. She answers Boaz gratefully and in all humility. "I am fortunate to have found favor in your eyes, my lord, for your words have comforted me. You have spoken to the heart of your handmaid, although I am not even as worthy as one of your handmaidens." And Boaz responds to her, a virtual stranger, with an amazing monologue. Remember from lecture number 1, of the 84 verses of these 4 chapters of this tiny Megillah, of this tiny book of Ruth, more than half of them are dialogue. The characters are reacting to each other and speaking to each other back and forth. It's actually fabulous. So here we have Ruth responding in all humility at his attention to her. She's relieved that she won't starve and go hungry and can bring grain home to her destitute mother-in-law. And Boaz responds to her response. Here she is, a virtual stranger, and he responds to her with an amazing monologue. He calls Ruth "my daughter," literally echoing Naomi's earlier word. Boaz says he has already heard about all the kindness that Ruth has shown her mother-in-law. That kindness, plus her choice to leave her homeland and follow Naomi into Judah and to become an Israelite, impress him. He says to Ruth, "In the Israelite tradition, one is repaid for such chesed," which we have defined as extraordinary, unexpected kindness, "as you have shown Naomi, not only by human means, such as my kindness to you, a gleaner in my fields. Your deeds also will be requited by a reward from our God. So my blessing to you," continues Boaz to Ruth, "is that you should be rewarded in full by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have sought refuge. May you bear children who will become leaders in Israel, and may your complete reward include that you, yourself, will be the mother of royalty." What an amazing and extraordinary blessing and prediction. Events are moving very quickly, almost overwhelmingly for Ruth. Boaz has just publicly predicted marriage, fertility, privilege, and even royalty for Ruth. This is unbelievably heady stuff. For a woman who is barefoot and in tatters, scratching along for her next meal among the leftover stalks of barley. Later that night, when Ruth returns to Naomi, Ruth recounts the details of her adventure at the barley harvest, telling her mother-in-law of the kindness of the master of the field. She says, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi, who of course recognizes the name of her husband's nephew, answers her daughter-in-law, issuing yet another blessing, but this time praising Boaz in God's name. What is happening here? Naomi, who had all but given up hope that God had any blessings in store for her, feels her spirit bubbling to life. She thinks, surely it is God's hand that has caused Ruth and Boaz to meet so fortuitously in his field today. This must be a sign that God, in his grace, has not forsaken the family of Elimelech. Dare I even hope that Boaz might love Ruth, and between the two of them, they would sustain the name of my dead husband? The thought is intoxicating. Just perhaps Boaz should marry Ruth. This would solve their problems, and also would be the ultimate act of chesed, or extraordinary kindness. She mentally ticks off the criteria for yibum, or levirate union, one of the two Israelite laws that are at work in the book of Ruth. We learned that last week. She mentally ticks off the criteria for yibum, or a levirate union. Ruth's husband Machlon has died, and he has left no issue. His brother Chilion, who would have been the next in line to step forward to marry Machlon's widow, also has died. Therefore, it would fall to a second cousin to Machlon, or even to a grand uncle, one of Elimelech's brothers, perhaps, to take Ruth in marriage. In this way, their first child would inherit Machlon's and Elimelech's landed portion, and Elimelech's name would not be lost in Israel, or his lands become forfeit to another family. So Ruth returns to Boaz's fields day after day through the 3 months of the barley harvest. Ruth is loyal, reliable, admirable, and heroic. But she also is a widow and childless, and lives on the edge of subsistence. We wonder, what will become of her now that the barley harvest is done? Naomi is worried. Boaz has made no further move toward Ruth, and now that the harvest is done, she is concerned that they will no longer be thrust into daily contact. Naomi resolves to act boldly and to precipitate a crisis. Naomi comes up with an almost unthinkable plan and proposes it to her daughter-in-law Ruth. She says to Ruth, "And now, is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maidens you are gleaning? Behold, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor this very night. You should bathe and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you should note the place where he will lie down, and later you should come and uncover his feet and lie down also, and he will tell you what you should do." This is Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Naomi is proposing a blueprint for forcing Boaz's hand. Both she and Ruth have been given to understand by Boaz's attentive behavior toward Ruth at the very beginning of her gleaning in his field, and implicitly over the course of the 3-month harvest, that he finds her both desirable and worthy of being his wife. Naomi knows precisely what is going on the threshing floor this day. More than 10 years after a devastating famine seized the land of Judah, the Israelites have experienced a bumper crop. The harvest is done, and sheaves are piled high in fat piles. In the cool of the afternoon, the grain is separated from the chaff in a laborious and primitive way. The sheaves are tossed into the air, catching the evening breezes while they are aloft. The chaff is blown away by the wind, and the grain, the precious grain, then falls to the ground, where it is cleaned and sorted. Thus are hundreds of piles of grain accumulated all through the long day and afternoon. Nighttime brings the winnowing or threshing ceremony, after which each landowner and his trusted foreman sleep an exhausted sleep nearby their own grain piles to guard against thievery. Naomi is telling Ruth that there will never be a better moment for her to approach Boaz than this night. She must approach him immediately, while her image is still fresh in his mind, and while the exuberance of an abundant harvest gladdens his heart. Furthermore, says Naomi, time is fleeting, and Ruth is in need of a redeemer. The problem is that the threshing floor is a male enclave during the hours spent winnowing, and after hours, the only women who enter the threshing floor, Rashi tells us, are prostitutes who service the landowners and the harvesters. It is not a place for a decent woman to be found. How can Ruth approach Boaz in a way that will best ensure success? What Naomi is proposing is daring, dangerous, and immodest. In our words these days, we would call it outrageous. Her only hurdle is Ruth's natural modesty and caution. How can Naomi convince Ruth to temporarily abandon her ingrained humble persona and behave in a sexually forward manner? After all, Naomi has spent the past 3+ months tutoring Ruth in the ways of the modest Israelite woman, erasing any trace of brazen Moabite. Would this conduct that Naomi has in mind qualify as Hebrew or as Moabite, as proper or as brazen? Will Ruth go along with it? It all comes down to trust. How deeply does Ruth trust Naomi to advise her wisely? How securely does Naomi trust Boaz not to take advantage or abuse Ruth? According to Aviva Zornberg, what Naomi proposes is nothing less than a seduction. Ruth's preparations, I'm quoting Aviva Zornberg right now, Ruth's preparations are to be those of a woman before a sexual encounter: washing, scenting, dressing, and secrecy. Close quote. The danger for Ruth is that as a levirate widow, unless she is released from her levirate obligation, she is forbidden to every man with the exception of Machlon's nearest kinsman. And the big question now is Boaz that man? Ruth hesitates. Should she risk everything and literally throw herself at Boaz's feet? Or should she wait for him to make his move? Or not? She weighs her options. She is as far down on the societal ladder as she can go. She is destitute, a Moabite immigrant reliant on the charity of others to eat. She is a stranger in a strange land and is chained to her dead husband's memory, so that by Israelite law she cannot marry any but the nearest kinsman. She reasons that really she has nothing to lose. If she acts and is rebuffed, she is still on the bottom rung of Israelite society, this time, though, without any hope of redemption. But if by some miracle she were to succeed, well then, her future would be made. She could perhaps conceive a child, and she and Naomi would never go hungry again. Ruth resolves to take the risk. That night, Ruth goes down to the threshing floor. She has washed, anointed her skin with sweet-smelling oils, unbraided her hair, dressed in her Sabbath dress, and prepared herself for the night's encounter. From her hidden spot, she waits as Boaz eats and drinks his fill. Ruth's future hinges on her seduction leading to Boaz agreeing to a proper, legitimate levirate marriage. A mere one-time sexual encounter would spell shame, failure, and death to her. So Ruth waits until all are asleep by their grain piles. Then she kneels down and gently uncovers Boaz's legs and stretches out next to him. Boaz wakes suddenly, and he is startled and fearful. He is chilled by the night air, and he is immediately aware that his body is uncovered. Simultaneously, he realizes that there is someone lying next to him. And in the text, more dialogue. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answers, "I am a maiden. I am Ruth, your handmaid." He asks her, "Why are you here?" She responds softly, saying, "Spread the corner of your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman." With the first half of her speech, Ruth is making a request. She's making an unambiguous appeal for a proposal of marriage. The specific expression to spread the corner of one's skirt over a woman is a trademark or badge of protection in marriage in the Bible. Ruth is hoping she is willing, and she is vulnerable. But interestingly, at the same time, the second half of the same verse contains Ruth's whispered plea. But it is not really a plea at all. It is a statement of Boaz's obligation. By adding the words, "For you are a redeeming kinsman," Ruth might as well have said, "Please marry me, and oh, by the way, you really have no choice in the matter. The law requires you to do this." Ruth couches a demand within her petition of marriage. Ruth is a vulnerable woman, and she has put herself in physical and moral jeopardy by secreting herself on the threshing floor that night. More personally, she has come to admire Boaz, and she desires his good opinion. She's afraid that he will reject her brazen behavior of coming to him in the middle of the night, uncovering him and stretching out next to him, offering herself to him in marriage. So what does Boaz do and say? This is Boaz's test. Boaz is a man, after all. It is the middle of the night, and as the Talmud, Sanhedrin, and Rashi tell us, he is wrapped in the arms of the beautiful and willing woman he most desires. Ruth's seduction is successful, and the Talmud and Midrash tell us that Boaz is strongly aroused and wants nothing more at that moment than to become intimate with Ruth. But Boaz knows he is not the nearest redeeming kinsman. We can practically see his rational self warring with his passionate physical self. The judge in Boaz knows that to take Ruth now, knowing as he does that he is not the nearest redeeming kinsman, would be an outright sin. For Ruth is offering herself to him, thinking that she will be thereby consummating a legitimate levirate union. On the other hand, the man in Boaz has been imagining just such a moment of intimacy with Ruth for the past 3 months, and he is more than ready to consummate the act. And so, according to another Midrash, that precise moment in the middle of the night on the threshing floor when Ruth seduces Boaz is the make or break test of Boaz as hero of our story. Had he succumbed to Ruth's seduction, it is likely that he would have morally forfeited the end he most desired, to acquire Ruth in levirate marriage. Let us see how Boaz meets this test. Boaz is at his core a man of honor. We know this because the text told us so in the first verse of chapter 2. He is an ish gibor chayil, a man of strength and valor. And we are taught in the Mishnah, quote, Ben Zoma says, Ezehu gibor, who is considered strong? one who subdues his own inclinations. Close quote. So Boaz's inner strength, sufficient for the Bible to immortalize him as Gibor, will draw him back from the precipice, will allow him to do what is morally right and not what is merely expedient. Because he is not the true Yavam, Ruth's true redeemer, sexual intimacy with Ruth would turn her into an adulterer. Boaz cannot do this to her. So he tells her, "While I am indeed your near kinsman, there is a kinsman closer than I." We can almost hear the death knell of Ruth's hopes. But who is closer kin than Boaz, we ask? It is his uncle Tov, also known in the book of Ruth, in the Megillah, as Ploni Almoni. He is Elimelech's only living brother. He is not given a name in the book of Ruth. It is the Midrash, or legend literature, that identifies him to us. Tov, the only brother still alive, is closer kin for levirate marriage purposes than is Boaz. Short-circuiting our story in the interest of time, the next day, in the presence of a quorum of the town elders, the closer kinsman refuses the offer to marry Ruth. Boaz redeems Naomi's land, and with it Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law, the childless widow of Boaz's second cousin. Boaz takes Ruth in marriage, and as the story draws to a close, we witness Ruth's continued kindness or chesed towards Naomi, and the promise of fertility is fulfilled. This story that began with famine, death, and infertility ends with harvest, bounty, and a new life. Ruth gives birth to a son, and she generously includes her mother-in-law in her tiny new family, allowing Naomi to serve as nurse to her grandson. The town elders bless Ruth as a matriarch in Israel, and the neighbor women praise Ruth as a mainstay for the aged Naomi, for bringing Naomi back to life. Fertility, blessing, and praise fill the closing verses of this amazing story. And the Megillah ends with an amazing genealogy. It traces Ruth's son Oved backwards to Judah and Tamar's story, to Judah and Tamar's son Peretz, and it traces Oved's line forward to the 10th generation until it reaches the literary present, proclaiming forever that the son of the union between the Moabite woman Ruth and Boaz, the prince in Judah, a boy named Oved, becomes the father of Jesse, who will be the father of King David. In closing, so we see that on Shavuot, this once agricultural holiday that also celebrates the giving of the law at Sinai, there could not be a more fitting portion of the Tanakh to read than the book of Ruth. At Sinai, Moses gave God's laws to a nation of ex-slaves and wandering, stateless strangers. 300 years later into the future, in Megillat Ruth, two strangers are tested by tragedy and hardship, and God's laws are also tested by Moabite and Israelite alike. Now you are armed with a measure of literary understanding of the actors of this Megillah, and are poised to appreciate the two amazing love stories that comprise it. There is absolutely no doubt that the second love story between Ruth and Boaz would not have been possible without the first, between Ruth and Naomi. In the symmetry of this marvelous Megillah, Boaz, the book's hero, is introduced to us as an Ish Gibor Chayil, a man of strength and valor, the perfect literary foil and counterpart and mate for our heroine Ruth, whom the town elders praise in chapter 4 as an Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. To the authors of the Megillah, Ruth and Boaz are the fitting duo to sire the Israelite monarchy. In the end, it is the people in the book of Ruth who pass the tests and make it work. We should ask ourselves, can we do any less? And here's a parting thought. In the Talmud in Bava Batra 91b, the Talmud has more to say about Ruth, telling us that she lives to a very old age, and even lives to see her great-great-grandson Solomon ascend the throne. The Talmud is as loath to part with Ruth as we are. So by all measures, Megillat Ruth, the book of Ruth, is a thrilling personal tale, replete with meaning and life lessons, one we happily revisit year after year on Shavuot. I thank you for inviting me to study it with you this holiday. Chag Sameach.